want to welcome you here is because we're still here. We still exist as an industry. The last couple of years, I wasn't sure if that was going to be the case. We've actually grown. AFRC is a bigger organization than it was a year ago. It's a bigger organization today because of the importance of federal timber, public timber. It's more important today than it's ever been. Every downturn in our industry that we've ever had, we're let out of it by government timber. And that's not the case today. Government timber isn't there to help us out of this quagmire that we're in. Sad state of affairs. Before I get going, I'd like to recognize three people. As I said, we're a bigger organization today than we were a year ago. And the reason we are is because I think three people. And I go back to the foundation that is AFRC and is NFA. I'd like to recognize Jim Geisinger for the foundation that he built and became this organization. Give Jim a hand, please. Tom Parton took the foundation that he got from Jim and built on. And like I say, in tough times, he sold this organization, the importance, the mission that we have, and we need to give Tom a round of applause. Foundations and building houses. While we were doing this, Cindy kept the walls straight and kept us all on track. And the only thing I do as chairman is what Cindy lets me do. So let's get I would like to take about 5 minutes. I'm supposed to set the tone of the meeting. And last year I stood up here and told you it was broken. It was completely broken. The federal timber sale program, management program was completely broken. And it hasn't changed. If anything, it's worse today than it was a year ago. I got some pushback last year that I made some people uncomfortable. Good. You shouldn't be comfortable with the state of things. It's a mess. We should be very uncomfortable with the way our forests are being managed today. And that discomfort maybe will lead us to a solution. But I don't want you to be comfortable. I want the conversation to be constructive. I want to beat up on the agency people. We can point out maybe the errors of their ways. I'd like it to be constructive. The other three C's, or the three C's, comfort, constructive. The other one we're going to hear a bunch about, I'm sure, is collaboration. One of my favorite words these days. When Jimmy Carter made Menachem and Anwar Sadat sit down and work things out, I think he provided adult supervision. They didn't just collaborate and come to the Camp David Accords. Somebody sat in a room and said, you're going to do this, you're going to do that. They listened, that there was adult supervision in the room. We can sit down and talk and talk and talk. We've been doing it for decades. And we're not going to come to an answer. Collaboration will only work if we have someone in the room that's going to make the tough decisions and provide that adult supervision. We have been sitting with folks, pilot projects in Southwest Oregon, and collaborating. And lo and behold, we've been getting some adult supervision. Congressman DeFazio's office, on a regular basis, has been talking to me, talking to others in our industry, talking to the other side, talking to the agencies, and really providing that leadership. I'm proud to say. So at this point, I'll introduced here. We all know that he's the dean of the Oregon delegation. He was first elected in '86. So he's been there a while. He's seen all the ballots. Probably got a few scars from the ballots. He serves on the Transportation Committee, senior member of the Transportation Committee. Serves on Aviation, Railroad, and Resource. Represents Southwest Oregon, which is the largest wood products producing district in the United States. There isn't a close second. In that district, there are parts or all of 9 national forests and BLM districts. Most importantly, he's my colleague.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate that. Good morning. And, it's a pleasure to be here yet again. I thought maybe we'd talk about something different today because, last night Jamie covered a wide range of federal issues, and I normally kind of talk about timber, so I thought instead I'd talk about literature. So we're going to start with Charles Dickens' Bleak House. And the reason I would start with Charles Dickens' Bleak House is because, I had to read it in college. I didn't think it was that great a book at the time, but I thought back to it a lot. It is, I think, one of his greatest books. And for those who don't remember or haven't read it, the basic premise is the dysfunction of the Chancery Courts in England, and it's essentially a satire in a lot of ways, but also it was a political document to try and push for reforms. But the story is about a multi-generational legal dispute over an estate, and the bottom line is by the time they finally finish the dispute in courts, there's nothing left. And that's a little bit of what I feel like has been going on with our timber policy in this country for a number of years. By the time we ever get out of the courts and get something done, we probably won't have an industry left because particularly those, or at least those who have some need for federal timber. And a lot of communities, counties, are going to suffer tremendously through this. And we're not going to have healthier forests because of the inactivity and the inaction over that time. So I would like not to live through that. I have been for quite some time, and I've been determined to try and break out. I've come here before and talked about why I opposed the Clinton Forest Plan way back then, and I predicted it wasn't going to work out, it wasn't going to resolve the principal issues, which really were about fighting over what was the remaining old growth for the environmental groups and for the industry accepting a lower level of harvest, but predictable. Neither of those things happened, and we're still in the courts. We just had yet another twist and a turn with the court ruling that the Obama administration improperly suspended the Whopper, and now they're back. They're still puzzling their way through that. Now, in that, I think, is potentially the seeds of a way out of this mess. And I keep saying to Travis, who staffs this issue very ably for me, but hasn't been doing this for so long, but I said, I remember the old wilderness disputes. And in the wilderness disputes, both sides had something that they wanted. The environmentalists wanted permanent protection in certain areas, and the industry wanted release. So you had a dynamic that could lead to resolution because both sides had something to gain and lose, and they were forced to discuss. Now, at various points, I think one side or the other in this longer dispute has thought we've got the upper hand and we don't need to come to the table, we're winning. And for some time it's been the environmental groups, and it's been very hard to get any or some of them to the table to meaningfully discuss how we can get people back in the forest. I mean, if you talk to them and say, oh no, we want to see rural communities, we support the counties, we want to see, but I said, okay, well, where's the there? What are you doing, or what will you do, or where will you get to get us to that point? And there hasn't been a lot, and sometimes I can get one or another in a room somewhere, and they'll say, yeah, I can live with that, but they get together collectively or in public, and it's like, suddenly, it's like we never talked about this before. We've had difficulties on the timber side, particularly more historically and earlier in my career, in having any meaningful discussion about a different way of managing lower harvest levels, things that would be sustainable long term. Well, I'm hoping now that the new uncertainty created by this will bring some of the environmental groups more actively and avidly to the table to discuss a longer term resolution for these lands. You know, last summer, or spring, I started by bringing together a group in Springfield. I got some outspoken members from both sides, from the industry and from environmental groups, and folks from the administration, and got Norm Johnson and Jerry Franklin involved to basically give their vision of a different way of managing these lands and managing over a much larger landscape in a different way than we have historically. You know, we sat around a room, didn't come to much agreement, and I guess my experience always has been when I was a county commissioner, we were trying to work on road projects, and things that I always say, gotta go out and look at them, gotta take people out to look at it. So I said, let's go out and look at what these forests would look like under these prescriptions. And when we went out in August, I think with one or two exceptions on the environmental side, there were people got in the dry forest and said, yeah, we can do that. The industry saying, oh, we can certainly harvest in those sorts of patterns. And there's a fair amount of timber going to come out of here. And a number of the environmentalists there said, yeah, so there were a few, you know, who didn't like it. But the point is, that was not tremendously controversial, but it was a very different way of doing forestry in those dry types. And it would yield predictable results over a pretty large landscape. Then we went to the wet forest types, and it became much more controversial because they're talking about a prescription that, you know, BLM doesn't really exist right now. You know, these regen harvests with skips and holes and small clear cuts, if you want to call them that, whatever you want to call them. But again, going into healthy, you know, but older stands that need, if they're going to be there and they're going to provide a longer-term forest, and they're going to provide more diversity in terms of you know, the forest dwellers and creatures, they need to have some you know, some openings. They need to have some younger trees coming up, and they need to have the browse and those sorts of things for young blades and all that. Much more controversial, but you know, they are continuing to push forward with this. Got another field trip planned for next Sunday, probably in the snow again. But they're moving forward. For the first time, we have some real buy-in at a high level in the administration. We've actually gotten some money set aside for these three projects by Secretary Salazar. And when he came out in October, I think he was pretty emphatic. He said, you know, we're doing nothing is not an option. This is going to change, and we're going to move forward. And we're going to move forward with you or without you. And he was sending, I think, a message to sort of both extremes in the debate, particularly at that point to a number of the environmental groups. Now, there are some here who think, well, these aren't very meaningful, these pilots. Let me just kind of explain why I think they're important. It is a breakthrough in the way we manage our forests. Now, there are those who say, well, yeah, but they're just these little classrooms in the woods, or these small pilots. That's true. But my idea is that they're instructive over what we would do over a much larger landscape. But we've got to get buy-in, we've got to bring people along, and we've got to demonstrate we can do this. We also have to see where the barriers are in doing this. I've urged them not to be restrictive. I mean, they're doing science. Now, some people like science until science tells them something they don't like, and then they don't like science anymore, they want different science. And they're looking at removing older trees. And, you know, way beyond the 80-year, you know, category. And there was some pushback, and then they're like, oh, maybe we should. I said, no, look, guys, apply the science, develop the science. You know, we're going to look at these different age classes, and sure, if you propose some stuff in these older stands, and we get symbolic stuff in an appeal or something like that, or litigation, I said, then that's instructive. That's all part of the process, but apply the science and move forward with what you're doing. We've got, for the first time, Fish and Wildlife saying, you know, the Fish and Wildlife was there, and they said, yeah, well, you know, some of the environmentalists are saying, oh, you know, we don't like it, you're taking out these older trees, but Jerry's explaining how we're replicating, you know, basically what happened in nature, and also we're looking at the long-term health of the forest. And the Fish and Wildlife guy basically said, and the environmentalists were saying, well, but this is owl habitat, and this is that, and so you can't do it. You know, what the Fish and Wildlife guy said, and Jerry and Norm said, and then he defended, which is, if it's good for the forest long-term, then it is good for the owls. And the Fish and Wildlife guy, for the first time, said, saying, oh yeah, we have 14 virtual overlapping, you know, owl circles here, and there's one tree you can cut. Said, no, actually, you know, we should look at this, and was favorably disposed. So if we can bring the public along, if we can get buy-in from some of the interest groups, and if we can bring the agencies along, potentially we have a defensible long-term plan that will be developed out of these pilots. It's, you know, a way for me, if we can do this. Ultimately, I believe we're going to have to legislate. The question is, what are we going to legislate? And the pilots could instruct us in what we would legislate in terms of forest practices in these lands longer term, and provide for much more predictability over a larger landscape. Now, that might work, it might not. I'm thinking maybe even a little more out of the box than that. That's mostly what I wanted to talk about today, your reaction to. You know, BLM, Forest Service, you know, they both had, and you've seen it, I mean, their capabilities are degraded with budget cuts. You know, they don't really have, I mean, you know, in terms of the agencies, very few people left to carry out a timber program, very few people left to do the recreation programs. I mean, they're really short-staffed in many ways, many mergers in that. So, you know, would we have to look at maybe even combining management between Forest Service and ONC and the BLM? We've got to be looking at that to see if we could bring more resources to bear. But maybe even that isn't going to be adequate when you look at some of the cuts that are being talked about in Washington. So maybe there's a different way to get there. And I'm going to sketch out two concepts. And the first would be, I've been talking with a group that manages, they're actually they're managing the second largest timberland holdings in the state, mostly the old IP lands, and they're managing them on behalf of some endowments and pension funds, who don't demand you know, what all the rapacious speculators on Wall Street want these days. They're not looking at those kind of rates of return. They're looking at good, regular, modest rates of return. That's what these funds want. They want stability. 6% is great, 7% is fabulous. But they're not thinking, gee, I got to turn 30% or 50% and get out. They're not doing that. They're looking long term. So I began a discussion with them, and we're not talking about awarding some kind of sole source contract, but I just wanted to get the perspective of someone who is managing long-term a large portion of the lands in the state. And I said, so what if we took these lands, the ONC lands, and we entered into a 99-year management contract with you? And you know, how could this work in terms of you know, taking, because we would need to take care of the counties too. And we've talked through it a bit, and obviously, you know, what they say to me is, look, you know, the more restrictions, the lower the net present value, you know, less money we'll put up front. You know, we've had a couple of presentations. I've arranged another one today that Kurt Schrader and Senator Merkley will be at to talk about this with some of the principals there, to kind of work this through. But the bottom line would be, we set out a management prescription. Now, what would the management prescription be? Well, that's partly why I want to have these pilots go forward, because that could be the management prescription across large landscapes of the ONC lands. We need to have a management prescription to put in the contracts and ultimately to perhaps to have to legislate in order to get into these contracts. It could be different than that. It could be something that follows sustainable forestry practices. It could be Oregon forest practices with certain portions of land reserved. But, you know, again, the more you put off limits, the lower the present value and what they'll put up front. I've also talked to them about local sourcing, and they say they're all about that. They want to maintain the infrastructure in the industry, so they say that wouldn't be a very expensive, if at all, cost in terms of lowering the value of the lands if we looked at some local sourcing requirements. I said, well, how about no log exports? They said, well, that takes a little bit more out of the value because clearly we could export logs and make more money. We're all seeing that today. But they said, we want to do that, we'll value it. So we could look at local sourcing, no log exports, you know, management prescription. And bottom line is, the potential is there for a multi-billion-dollar upfront endowment for the counties, which we then could use and realize, you know, the investment earnings from to help the counties meet their long-term needs. And we would have someone managing the lands long-term who would not be subject to the vicissitudes of the federal budget, the appropriations process, and the cuts. They could, you know, when it made sense, put more people on, more people out there, and do more harvesting when the market's good. Since they're there long-term, they would do it on, you know, would have some guarantees about some sort of minimum activity, even when markets are down. My idea would be that we would say, okay, here's all the prescriptions, here's all the conditions under which to manage these lands. Here's what's available, here's what's off limits, here's what they're going to pay. And anybody that doesn't like this, sue now. And you get to sue once. And that's it. No, I'm serious. I mean, because we would then, once, you know, go through this process, here it is. Now, if you think that we're violating something or some law, let's have the litigation, get it over with, and once the contract's entered into, it's a contract. And unless they violate the contract, you cannot sue ongoing activities. So, you know, they say, well, they say, well, yeah, we have to have something like that, but that would be great if you do it that way. So that's one vision, in how we could bring some more potential stability longer term to these lands. Obviously, it's not going to be without controversy, but again, I'm somewhat hopeful that, you know, with the potential that, well, maybe the Walker, some parts of the Walker are going to move forward, but then they're going to be immediately litigated, but it's not certain how that's all going to work out. Ultimately, it's all going to end up perhaps at the Supreme Court. Who knows what they'll do these days. You know, there might be enough uncertainty for some of the environmental groups out there to say, well, it's worth coming to the table and talking about these things. And I know there's a lot of people in this room who would like to come to the table and talk about some of these things. I did have another major player, not quite an environmental group, but someone who's very actively involved in forest management issues and often advocates from the environmental point of view, come to me and say, how about a different idea that he didn't know what I was looking at in terms of contracting. And he said, what if we took these lands and basically divided them in half? We would have a process to determine what's in the conservation half and what's in the timber half. And you know, there's various ideas about how that process would be developed, how the lands would be divided. And then, under this person's idea, you would have a board, you know, essentially a public board, but they would be responsible for implementing the vision on the timber side and the vision on the conservation side, try and make money on the conservation side with carbon credits or whatever else you put over there, but look at managing those lands in a way that makes sense for conservation purposes, which doesn't necessarily just mean leave them alone altogether. But manage more aggressively on the timber side. And I was a little shocked when he said this, but he said, how about we would do Oregon forest practices on the other half of the lands? Again, it's kind of back to that construct of what we had when we did wilderness, which is, on the one hand, a lot of environmental groups say, you can't do that. On the other hand, you say, well, wait a minute, you're getting half these lands in a conservation easement, essentially. And the other half are going to be managed. Now, isn't that a pretty big win for you? I don't know whether we could move them that far or not, but obviously if you could manage the other half of the lands, and this would generally be obviously lower stuff, and very productive lands under Oregon forest practices, then certainly the industry would have the prospect of predictability and adequate volumes of timber for as far as the eye can see. So I think it's just really time to, I'm going to keep pushing on the pilots because I think they instruct and underlay a lot of this. But I'm looking at bigger ways to step forward. I mean, there is the other possibility that we just go forward, we do the pilots, and then we say, okay, we are going to do this sort of management over the entire ONC landscape and possibly the Forest Service landscape. And Forest Service has been coming along, and they are interested in this and have been tracking on the idea of the regen work in the patterns that Norm and Jerry prescribed in moist forests. Fish and wildlife, like I say, is coming along. So there is a possibility we could just say, okay, these other ideas are too big, they're too out of the box. We'll just stick with the agencies. We'll have to fight over trying to get the resources to implement these plans. We're probably going to end up going through some more litigation, but maybe that is a vision moving forward. I'm not sure exactly what is the best, but Paul was right when he said it's broken. And what I've said and what I said at the time when I opposed the Clinton Forest Plan to environmental groups and others, and I'd say, what is it you get when you draw a line around a tree farm and call it a late successional reserve? What do you get in 40 years? You get an overgrown tree farm. You don't get what we all would recognize as a healthy, functioning, diverse forest landscape. And that's where a lot of our lands are headed. Whether you're talking Southern Oregon with the threat of fuel buildup and fire, or whether you're talking the moist forest, particularly you look at the Coast Range and overly dense plantations in areas that were previously harvested that are, they're just not going to develop adequate root systems. They're too close together. If you ever did get in there to robustly thin, you're going to have a lot of blowdown. And then up into the Cascades, where again, we're not doing any management, and the moist forests, even in the Cascades, need continued management. Humans are here. We're having an impact on the environment. I don't think we're going to stop suppressing fires. And so, therefore, we have to manage activities in a way that, we would have those forests look more like they would have looked through natural processes as opposed to sort of some unnatural stasis and freezing in time. It just doesn't work. So that's a little bit. I'd be happy to talk about either forestry. I'd be happy to talk about any of the other topics I raised last night, the budget, foreign affairs, anything else, any distraction that you want. So, how's that?
Or literature.
Or what?
Or literature.
Literature? Well, no, I thought Bleak House was instructive in terms of how this is all playing out. So, pretty quiet at this point. Kind of like too early. Yeah.
Given our budget deficit, what is perceived for the federal agencies, land management agencies going forward? They've taken, not a big cut in the last 15 years.
Yeah, no, it's pretty grim, and we heard a little discussion of that last night, but maybe just expand on it a little bit. We just went through this big budget process, and we did do some substantial reductions. I voted for the ultimate compromise package. They had to get Democrat votes to pass it because there was some more new and radical members of the Republican caucus who said not enough. Well, if you look at it on a one-year basis, it's twice 38 billion because we're in the 6th month, so it's 38 billion for the rest of the year. So we've already spent up to that point. So that's 76 billion, and we were only looking at about $500 billion of the federal budget. We weren't looking at the 3 trillion dollar budget we hear about. We were looking at 16% of that budget, and we got essentially about 16% of that 16%. That's a pretty big one-year whack. And unfortunately, Forest Service, BLM, and other domestic agencies are in that area that's getting whacked, and that's where a lot of the future whacks are looking to. I want to expand the universe of where we're looking to cut. I would take, a lot of things were left off the table. DOD, which is much bigger, and the Defense Department is about $800 billion with the war. So that's, it's almost twice as large, not quite twice as large as the rest that we were looking at. We got to be looking there. We've got to look at so-called entitlements, including the agriculture programs. The agriculture spends $20 billion a year for people who grow surplus crops or grow nothing and get paid for it. Nuts. In fact, we're paying. I was involved in one amendment on the floor where we're paying to Brazil $200 million a year because we lost the WTO case on cotton, so that we can continue to subsidize cotton in the United States. We're paying Brazil $200 million a year to keep our agriculture subsidies for cotton. We offered them to not do that anymore, but we didn't win. So we've got to expand where we're looking for cuts, and that does mean you're going to put things like Medicare, Medicaid, or Social Security out there, but there are better ways than what's been proposed to deal with it. So if you look at the larger universe, you're still, it's still looking pretty tough, given the magnitude of all the cuts. If we eliminated everything that the government, that you think of as the government today, that is, we have no Defense Department, no Pentagon, no military, we have no federal judiciary, no prison system, no border controls, no Coast Guard, no nothing. Go on down the list. It's all gone. Every single bit of it. We would still have a deficit. That's how big the problem is. So you've got to go beyond the general fund expenditures, look at the governments, but you've also got to look at the revenue side. And that's where we're failing the most. I mean, the whack that we're going to take out of things is going to be really severe if we don't look at the revenue side. You can't get your business. You've got to get your income, your earnings, and look at your outcome. We're only looking at the outcome. We're not, when that one vote, and I wasn't just focusing on the wealthy folks, which a number of Democrats were saying, and Obama was saying, well, we don't want to continue the tax cuts for people over 250. I said, no, let's go back to the Clinton era rates for everybody. Everybody. We all did pretty well at that point in time. We had 4% unemployment. We balanced the budget, and actually we began to pay down the debt. And yeah, that would take a little. Even middle-class families would pay a little bit if you went back to the Bush tax rate. But, other people, I mean, it's 3% for people at the top. That's, to me, not a totally egregious amount of money. And that would have cut our deficit in half over the next 10 years. That one vote, if we had not continued the Bush tax cuts, which were passed when we were in surplus, and they were talking about paying off the federal debt, they said, well, let's just give the money back to people because we don't need it. We're going to pay off the debt, and that would be bad. So, let's go back to that. And so you've got to look at both sides. But if we don't have the debate rationally, the outlook for agencies like the Forest Service, BLM is grim. I mean, we're just going to try and focus all of the cutting in that small part of the budget. So, yep.
Keith Harkin from National Woodland Owners in Washington, D.C. Your comment about the ONC lands and that management contract has got some real potential. The Forest Service in other parts of the country, and in earlier life, I'm a retired district ranger, but they, through the stewardship contracting provisions, which you had part of, the adjacent private landowners, like Oregon Small Buildings, well, I'm not sure it works here in Region 6, to be honest, but it has worked in other regions where they do some joint management, and the Forest Service has contracted with them. So there is some precedent. At the scale you're looking at, you probably experience quite a bit of pushback, but it's worth looking at.
Well, remember that, and as you know, the ONC lands are, and that's why I didn't expand this vision at the moment to Forest Service lands, although with the checkerboard it might be, and we got checkerboard private and we got controverted, ONC. I mean, there's some questions about how the Forest Service would be involved in this too. But let's just restrict it to BLM ONC lands. They're unique. They're absolutely unique, and that's in part what the litigation is based on, is the unique nature of the charter, the compact between, between the state, the counties, and the federal government regarding those lands. So you're right. I'm sure it's going to be controversial, but on the other hand, I'm just saying if we can construct it so each side's got something at risk and something to gain, we may be able to get it done. I don't know. Yes.
I applaud your thinking long term on getting us out of this gridlock. I think that's great, and hopefully we'll arrive at a long-term solution. But until we get there, what is your perspective on any short-term legislative assistance that might be there? Say, for example, getting rid of survey and manage, or something else to help us in the next couple of years while we get to a long-term solution.
I mean, it's a good question, and I don't know what the prospects would be. I mean, when you talk to Jerry and Norm, if you get them in a candid conversation, they'll say, we didn't anticipate this stuff. All the virtual house circles and all the overlays and everything and all of, everything that has made the Clinton plan dysfunctional. I think I was, anticipated it more than they did at the beginning. I mean, those are potential alternatives right now. I mean, I've been focused on the pilot projects to get those moving. I just had a conversation with some folks last night. I thought the Forest Service was going to help us out down in Southern Oregon with some sales that they've got ready to go, essentially. But it turns out they're being a bit parsimonious with that for some reason, and I've got to get involved in that. So I've been looking kind of at the micro level, what I can do then immediately. And then, short term, we could be looking at those sorts of legislative solutions. How we would do that and how we would avoid getting litigated doing that is an interesting, conundrum. I hope to get Senator Wyden a bit more involved in all this, since he does chair a subcommittee of jurisdiction in the Senate. But he's pretty much saying until Bingman's gone, he doesn't think he can get much done. So, we'll see. So, yes.
I asked Congressman Herrera last night this question, and with your long-term tenure in the House, I'd like to have your answer to the question that I asked about. We have created a culture where our agencies are dictating to the people of the United States. They've taken the strings out of your hand and put them into a dance that we have no recourse on. And so that's a bigger picture, because it's affecting our manufacturing plants, it's affecting everything. And is it possible for the Congress of the United States to take these strings back in their hands and actually okay the rules that the agencies are writing over the people of the United States? I mean, this is an issue that's really strangling this country and its ability to put people to work. And so I'd like to hear answer to that.
Well, there actually is a legal process. It was something that was implemented sometime when Gingrich was Speaker of the House. I can't remember exactly what year, but it gives Congress the authority to review and sets it basically says that you've got so many days to vote to approve or disapprove a pending rule. And in fact, we just took a vote in the House, but it's one of the first I remember, and it's because it involves AT&T and these huge, powerful interests, and it's the whole idea of the basically internet net neutrality. And so, that was scheduled, we voted on it, we voted to stop the rule, but the Senate's not going to take it out. So there is a process rarely used to do that. More what we try and do is come in and try and influence the agencies when they're about to do something really dumb, like with the biomass rules at EPA, or there was something else. We've got the whole thing non-point, this how we're going to deal with this issue of forest roads as point source pollution, which is a crazy idea. And so we're attempting to influence the agencies in those areas. And we did have success with the biomass rule. Hopefully we'll have success with this other. But there is a point at which, Congress can't administer day-to-day the government. I mean, it's not in our charter, we set the policies. But we can certainly do more oversight. And I'm also, and this is getting a little field for you, but this is something I've believed in for a long time. We should go to a 2-year budget cycle and say, well, what does that matter? Well, what does matter? Right now, we're in a perpetual budget cycle. That's about all we ever do is fight over spending. No matter who's in charge, that's what we do. Didn't even finish the budget last year. If we had a 2-year budget cycle and mandated it has to be done in the first year, or there would be mandatory things that would happen in terms of spending, similar to some of the law we have passed that expired after Clinton left office, PAYGO. And then you spend the second year on oversight, where you bring these agencies and you look at what they're doing and you examine, like, you really think this is the intent of the law we passed, what you're doing here? and bring them in and, rake them over the coals a little bit and try and, give them someone looking over their shoulder, because we're going to have the agencies to implement and, fill out what we create as laws, and implement them with rules. But we could do a better job of, making them, a little less all-powerful, a little more focused on getting, the job done. I mean, I won't go into the details, but I've been involved in a 5-year fight to dry bar scalping on the Chetco River. We're aggregate board in Southwest Oregon, on the coast in particular. And the only alternative is truck the stuff over from Denver here. That's crazy. You can bring trucks down to California, back up to the South Coast, I mean, that's nuts. So for years, we have gone in when the river drops down in the summer, they go in, and these contractors, they take the huge rocks out, and that's the aggregate, and they're not in the river at all. The river's is way over there somewhere. And we got into a dispute over that when one agency served its jurisdiction 2 years ago, and I still don't have a resolve. At one point last year, I thought I had a resolve, and then I didn't. And another point last year, I was on the phone. I had 12 people in the bar of the judges' chambers in the courthouse, and I had about 15 people on the speakerphone and all these different agencies. I'm trying to get them to, we got to get this done. How are we going to get it done? So I share some of your frustration, and I'm always looking for ways to make it work better. Yeah.
I just wanted to thank you and your office for all the work you've done. I work with a lot of the delegation offices in the Northwest and elsewhere, and the amount of time your office spends on all of these issues, whether it's Boiler Act or EPA tailoring rule over the last year, and now a lot of the work you guys are putting into the pilots, it really is appreciated. So just wanted to let you know that. What's your take? You outlined some ideas here on, kind of ONC and county payments and where they start to mix. Where do you think the rest of, what's going to take to pull the rest of the delegation together in Oregon on, something like this, some of the options you outlined? A lot of the details will have to get worked out, but what's your take on the topic?
Well, I've talked to, I mentioned it at a delegation meeting recently, and Senator Merkley and Representative Schrader particularly expressed interest. That's why I'm having this meeting later today with them to discuss this in more detail. I'd like to get other members of the delegation more involved, and we'll after this meeting today see how we can do that. But I'm just doing my best to network and bring them along. Anybody else? Oh, yes. Yeah.
Peter, even if we're optimistic that pilot projects could reach a consensus at some point in the future, probably realistically it would be 2, 3, or 4 years before the work is done, the paperwork is finished, the projects are implemented and evaluated. What do you want to be able to do on the ceiling nets for the next 3 or 4 years while we're waiting?
Well, I'm Mark. I mean, it's a good question in terms of what is the short-term plan. I haven't been putting so much time and energy into this. I mean, my idea is that we get these things moving forward. It isn't necessarily to go to some long-term study and conclusion. Well, we did them. Now let's develop the paperwork and let's do the analysis. No, I say, look, we did it. It worked. Let's do it over a larger landscape, and let's start planning for that. I mean, that's. I would hope to have a much more curtailed time schedule than 3 or 4 years from now, finish a pilot, and then begin to evaluate whether we could apply those pilots over a larger area. I'd like to see the pilots up and going this year, and a year from now say, well, that worked pretty well. Now let's do it over the larger landscape, and here's how we're going to do it, whether it's through this contractual relationship or whether we're going to have the agencies do it, or we're going to probably have to legislate it. I mean, along those lines, that's the best I can give you right now. I'm open to ideas. We got other ideas. I mean, it may well be that this administration is going to have to implement parts of the WAPA, and that could both yield some timber and also hopefully bring more people to the table. Anything else? Okay. Yeah.
I mean, everybody in this room has to worry about fuel costs, and I'm wondering about the commodities trading that is going on, and they're just like ticket scalpers. It used to be illegal, and now they're the ticket scalpers, but everybody has to go to the concert and they can name the price. And is it, you know, some kind of alternative energy like T-Boone Pickens plan to, you know, offset some of the costs or to bring it down, and, you know, what can be done?
Great question. You know, part of the Wall Street reform last year did give the commodities, reinstated some authority of the Commodities Future Trading Commission to limit the size of contracts people hold, concentration of contracts, and require that they be traded across exchanges so they're actually transparent as opposed to opaque. Those rules haven't been completed yet. I actually had, I've been speaking out quite a bit about this, and it's very unusual. I had one of the members of the Commodities Future Trading, because I was involved in a hearing, and I said, you know, what about the speculation? Right? You know, Kenlay is dead, Enron's bankrupt and gone, but the Enron loophole still lives, which is to allow people who were not actively engaged in, you know, they're not hedging. They aren't an airline, they're not a railroad, they're not a trucking company, they're not someone who consumes the product. They're just financially speculating and trying to drive up the price to make money on their contracts. And he wrote to me and he said, you know, he said he thinks it's a very big factor in the current run-up, that they need to get these rules in place. And unfortunately, right now, the new majority in the House is trying to slow them down. In fact, take away their authority to put in place new rules. It's just crazy to me. I mean, somehow we built a great country without all this speculation. Before the Enron loophole, you know, people, you know, you're a wheat farmer, you might go out and buy wheat contracts because you're worried about what's going to happen to your harvest, you know. You know, you're engaged. That all worked quite well. And it gave liquidity to the markets, it gave people some security. But this whole new thing that's been created that suddenly we can't live without because they provide market signals and all this, it's just crap. And it's all excess costs that we're paying. You know, the total oil supply is not bad. I mean, OPEC has filled the gap from what isn't coming out of Libya. There's no shortage, but the price is running up very steadily. What's going on here? And it's got to be speculation and market manipulation and OPEC manipulation. I've tried to get Clinton, Bush, now Obama, 3 administrations to file a complaint against OPEC and the WTO. I said, look, we're always being told we're paying Brazil $200 million a year because we lost in the WTO. Well, how about OPEC? They're manipulating oil. It's illegal, and 4 of them are members, so we could get, you know, we could win a judgment against them. You know, not so much. So, so there's that, and then longer term, and that's a way to get some short-term relief. Longer term, we are going to do more domestic production, but we don't have, even if we could access all the oil that is potentially out there, we would still be, it isn't going to solve our problems. Natural gas, the Pickens plan, I'm a sponsor of a bill that would move us along on that. That looks like you know, a good sort of bridge fuel to the future, as it's very plentiful, particularly with these new extraction techniques. And we're now developing heavy engines, you know, big, that we think we can get there pretty efficiently now, maybe with big trucks even. And natural gas, we've been doing delivery trucks and little things, but you know, there's a couple of companies working on that. And then longer term, you know, I'm very bullish on the idea of turning woody biomass, including, you know, what's waste to us, into liquid fuels. I mean, we can do direct conversion. That's why I'm made to turn it into electricity. But we did a pilot on the Umpqua this last year. One of the county commissioners down there, particularly Joe, has been pushing this, and where they brought this portable plant into the woods, and they could, through a pyrolytic process, create biodiesel out of wood waste. And there's a guy in Sweet Home who's bought a plant that was operating in Montana, and he's got a short line railroad, and he says that, you know, when he gets this up and going, he's going to improve it. He thinks he can run his railroad for the next 3 years just on clearing his right-of-way along the railroad and converting it to biodiesel. Now think of the potential there. It's a portable plant, fits in a container, 2 containers. You could, rail lines run through most of our most remote areas. You know, you can take this stuff out, you know, take it out there, get the portable plant set up, go out and do all the thinning work you need to do, create, and then just put the stuff in tank cars and take it out of there. You don't have to move all the woody biomass out of the forest and truck it to a generator. So that even has, so there's long term, I think things that can be tremendous, but short term, we got to stop getting price caps.
Diesel at $4.50 are likely to be synonymous terms for the foreseeable future. You being on the transportation committee, we have the main study behind us at 97,000 pounds of GVW. I'm wondering if, given the price of fuel, if there's any potential to create a more uniform GVW across the country at 105,000 pounds, like we do in Washington, Montana, and Idaho, and Arizona, so that we don't have the interstate reconfiguration of trucks and all that nonsense. And we have the studies, as you know, are in that higher gross vehicle weight, get up to 20% reduction in fuel consumption, up to 20% reduction in emissions, better truck safety because you have 20% fewer trucks on the road, et cetera, et cetera. And put the 6-year reauthorization with a focus on taking care of the deficient bridges to get to 105,000 pounds.
Well, I'm actually, I chaired the subcommittee last year. I was in a lot of discussions with the industry. The full committee chairman at that point in time was pretty hard over against it, and I was in a different position saying, I think there's a way to do this. And most of the discussions I had about the heavier weights were we've got to have the right axle configurations because we don't want to be creating more stresses on the bridges. And they also, we're all there with that. Also talked about, the safety evidence, big pushback versus did this and that. And I said, well, we're gonna have like the new technologies for side detection, and following, those sorts of things that are out there now. So it all exists. So I think it's doable, and I think it's something that would make a lot of sense. I'm not sure. I would think, I'm not sure. I mean, we have not gotten to that level of discussion yet about reauthorization. We just had our first bipartisan meeting over it, and they're working on language now for the bill that they say we'll see soon after we get back. So I'm not going to presume where they'll go. I'm still where I was. I'm a Democrat. I would assume there'd be a number of Republicans that support that, so maybe we can get that done in the bill. The biggest problem with the bill is they're talking about being restricted by the Ryan budget and reducing our investment. Today, we would reduce our spending on roads, bridges, highways, and transit by 35% from today's levels under that budget. That's nuts. We had 2 bipartisan commissions named when Republicans controlled the House, the White House, and the Senate. They met separately. They both came to the same conclusion. Read the reports. Our system's falling apart, and we need to invest more, not less. Otherwise we're going to have these things where you have to divert your truck 300 miles. We had a point where heavies had to go up over the Cascades, go down the other side of the mountains, and then come back down again just a few years ago until we started to deal meaningfully with our cracked bridge problem here. So, it doesn't help with just in time. Obama finally hit a note on this, although he hasn't been very helpful to me on this, when he said, this is important to business and for people who are looking at investing here, if they can't move their goods and stuff efficiently for just-in-time manufacturing and all those sorts of things. So we're going to have a fight over that, and I'm of the position we need more revenue, and they have a rule no new taxes, so I'm proposing that we just index the existing gas tax, and if we did that, it would mean about $0.01 a year, the gas tax would go up. And you assume how much money is going to come in through that adjustment over 20 years, and you put the bonds in up front. And I've been working with a guy in the bond house, and he said, well, you probably bond 120, 140 billion up front. So we wouldn't have to reduce, in fact, we could increase our investment in transportation infrastructure, which is what I think we need to do. And we have the strongest Buy America rules of any departments of the government in transportation. So if we do make those investments, we're going to put a lot of people to work in this country, because it isn't going to go. There's one little area that needs to be tightened up, and I think I've got agreement on that, where the Oakland Bay Bridge was built in China disastrously, in a plant that was built by an American company because they bid it overseas, because the Chinese didn't have a plant that could build these members either, and then they didn't work out, and they had to redo them all when they got here, because they segmented the project, and as we get rid of that loophole, it'll be all Buy America stuff in the future, and that's what we need to do. We invest the money for people to work and a better system. So, thanks.